It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting at my website, emailrevealer.com, or you can just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Now, we got an excellent guest today. Okay, his guest is Aaron J. Leonard. You can find him at his website, aaronleonard.net, and he's the author of several books along the same theme. The Folk Singers and the Bureau, the FBI, the Folk Artists, and the Suppression of the Communist Party, USA to 1939 to 1956. Another one is Heavy Radicals, the FBI Secret War on America's Maoists, the Revolutionary Union and the Revolutionary Communist Party. And a third one is Threat of the First Magnitude, FBI Counterintelligence and Infiltration from the Communist Party to the Revolutionary Union. And there's another one, too, the Folk Singers. Did I mention that one already? I think I did. Yeah.
Yep, you did.
So, Mr. Aaron J. Leonard, tell us about yourself. Who is Aaron J. Leonard?
Oh, yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
It's good to meet and talk. I'm a writer and historian living out here in Los Angeles County, sunny L.A. You know, I'm decamped from living for several decades in Brooklyn. So, you know, kind of enjoying soaking up the sun. But I was a lifelong radical and kind of moved on, you know, a decade or so ago and sought to examine some of the organizations, you know, I had worked with, particularly the Revolutionary Communist Party. I mean, they're still around, but nothing like, you know, what they had been, you know, at their inception. So in looking at them and digging into their history, I started to come across, you know, mountains of documents from the FBI. It's kind of one of the biggest underreported FBI domestic security investigations from the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, it didn't come out in the Church Committee period because it was still ongoing. Anyway, looking at that, I discovered a lot of FBI files, and along with my colleague Connor Gallagher, we compiled enough information to write two books, you know, one on the group itself and the second on informants who had penetrated the top levels of groups like the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, you know, the Revolutionary Union. So, you know, having those two books under my belt, I wanted to change it up a little bit. And write about music. You know, the original idea was write about repression in 60s music, but I couldn't quite get the data back then. But I landed on all this information from the FBI files on the folk singers of the 40s and 50s, people like Woody Guthrie, Burl Ives, Pete Seeger, Bess Lomax. So, you know, it kind of brings us up to date of the book and where I am right now. Of course, now I'm returning to this music book on the 60s, but maybe more on that later.
Let me ask you a quick question. If the FBI were so intense on surveilling American citizens, and that they would go to the length of infiltrating folk singers and spying on folk singers and trying to manipulate folk singers, do you believe that they really can't get a grip on these Proud Boys and these 1%ers and these 3% guys?
You know, of course they can, right? And I mean, they probably know a lot more than what we know now. I guess my initial reaction as you were asking the question is, you know, I think people have a lot of trust in government, as skeptical as people can be, but you know, the reality is like every country in the world has a secret police, and that you know, that's true for the United States as well. You don't survive and exist as a major power and force in the world unless you have a secret police who's looking at things like political dissent that could actually if not challenge the ruling authority, could really destabilize it. And if you look at the FBI as a political police, it's much clearer who they are and what they do and why they do it. And, the conflict with groups. So the Proud Boys, it's just a very peculiar array, because not only are these, right-wing dissidents, they actually have connections with the very highest political authorities. So it makes it a lot more, nuanced and prickly as to how to go after that, or how to not so much go after it, but how to relate to that, if I could use that word.
Yeah, but I guess also too, because the Proud Boys are capitalists, and that seems to be what they're enforcing most strictly.
Yeah, the January 6th thing was a certain crossing a line. A lot of what they had been doing up to then was, there was kind of a looking the other way by a lot of law enforcement and the Justice Department. But, when you start going into Congress and actually attacking, elected political officials, it becomes a whole different thing. But even there, it's, there's this bizarre scenario that, who is it, Matt Gaetz, I think the day of or that evening started saying, oh, it was Antifa.
Yeah.
This absurd lie. But these people, they got no shame, do they?
That's the truth, man. That is the truth. They look you right in the face, man. So where do you want to start with all this? I'm kind of fascinated about the folk singer aspect of it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because my musical core is kind of boomer music and 70s music, David Bowie, Lou Reed, but big appreciation of Bob Dylan, Grateful Dead, and the Beatles. So the folk singers was not my thing. I had a vague sense of it and a vague appreciation. I made the mistake once of talking to a class on this subject and saying, well, Pete Seeger was never really my favorite, and people were, oh boy, oof, they were upset. I've actually come to appreciate Pete Seeger a lot more. But these folk singers in the 40s and 50s, without them, they were excavating this quintessential American music, from Appalachia, Mississippi Delta, and the cowboy songs of Texas. They excavated this music, and it actually, in the mid to late 50s, there was this whole folk revival that actually, in turn, evolved up into the, counterculture, folk rock and things like that. So, there's a continuity, or an evolution, if you will, whereas when you unearth good things and they're valuable, they tend to get passed along. So, looking at the work of Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, for example, I came to appreciate it a lot more. But then when you look at these guys, the way I landed on this was, so I was going to write this book about the FBI and rock music in the 60s. Did they have files on Jefferson Airplane or MC5, Sam Cooke, Nina Simone? And I tried to get some files, and I wasn't getting anything. The FBI's, Sam Cooke's file, they say it was destroyed. Nina Simone, they say they can't find it. So I can't write this book without these files. As it turns out, I've since had some success, but so I'm trying to write this book about the 60s, and I'm reading this book by Sean Wilentz on Bob Dylan in America, I think it's called. And he's talking about Woody Guthrie. And I'm reading it, and I'm saying, naively, I think a lot of people already understood this. I'm like, wow, this Woody Guthrie, he must have been a communist. Not just a populist, but a, card-carrying communist. So I sent off and got his FBI file. It came quick because somebody had already gotten it. And I'm reading through it, and I'm like, whoa. They've been following this guy for decades. They didn't prove he was a communist. I've since come to understand, Guthrie was probably in the party for a short period around maybe 1941, 1942. but he had discipline issues. Anyway, so I get his file, and I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. I'd read somewhere that Pete Seeger's file had been released, so I asked for that, and that came. And I said, well, this is really interesting. Let me ask for Burl Ives' files, because I know he had been, Burl Ives is Sam the Snowman from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I knew Burl Ives had, I knew he'd been called in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. So I got his file. Whoa, that was interesting. So then I looked at all these, they're called left-wing folk singers, Bess Lomax, Sis Cunningham, Millard Lampel. They all have files, on down the line. And the thing they have in common is they're either in the party or, pretty close supporters, what the popular culture calls fellow travelers. So, I realized I've got a book, and that is actually how this evolved.
Well, Guthrie used to have a sign on his guitar that said, "This machine kills fascists." So that was probably enough to put them over the line.
It's a trip. The FBI, they have their headquarters files. These are the things that are stored in Washington.
Yeah.
And they tend to be the PG version of the files, right? It's the stuff that they really have to keep. But if you can get access to the field office files, and in Guthrie's case, I got access to his New York and Los Angeles files because he had lived in both locations, and nobody had ever gotten them. And so there's a lot of material in the book on that. And in his... I believe it's the New York file. There's pictures of him holding that guitar, and it's a posed photo, of Guthrie standing out, almost like a publicity shot, with "This machine kills fascists." But the thing about it is it's taken in Spokane, Washington, and as near as I can tell, it's taken by an informant. It's not published in the papers. It's in the FBI's file. So... they're really looking at Guthrie. They're very concerned about him. Of course, the complexity is that the Communist Party in the 40s are, more pro-war in terms of World War II than, many facets of the U.S. Social structure. So they actually have a common cause with the Roosevelt administration in that period, and there's a fair amount of tolerance for the Communist Party. I mean, not embrace or acceptance, but they were happy to have the support in waging World War II, which was this totally fierce and astonishingly awful historic event. But the CP ended up on the side of the U.S., the Allies, because they were in coalition with the Soviet Union. Of course, that all came to an abrupt end in 1946-47 when the Cold War began.
Did you ever pull your own FBI file?
I asked them, and they said, "Oh, we don't have anything," and I was hurt. I felt like, well, what am I, chicken liver or something?
Well, don't get too disappointed because I asked for mine. And they said they didn't have one, and they arrested me. Okay, so they had to have something out there, but they said they had nothing.
Well, it's funny because I read James Comey's book, or at least I read major parts of it, and I was actually struck by how superficial his understanding of Hoover's FBI was. I mean, it's almost like he's restating some of the media tropes about the abuses under Hoover and stuff, which is to say, I think even in today's FBI, they don't understand what they have. I mean, I subsequently got some files where I actually am referenced because I had been arrested in a political demonstration. The charges were dropped because, I actually wasn't breaking the law. But they had followed up, and they had gone to where I was living, and they had checked in with their local contacts. So I am actually in there, and I suspect, there's got to be more there. So there may be more on you. But my point is the FBI, wasn't it a couple of years ago there was a whole scandal about they had spent $1 million or something on a new database, which was a total failure? I mean, it's, these government administrations are in many ways not as sophisticated as private companies, and I'm not saying now that the FBI, doesn't have some sophisticated technology. I suspect they've probably improved, but there could be a number of reasons why, certain things fall through the cracks. But, in the case of the folk singers, most of these files really get going after this informant, Harvey Matusow, shows up. Matusow is, he's a young guy. He's coming out of the Army. He joins this group called People's Songs in the late 40s, which was supposed to be a national aggregation of groups popularizing, workers' songs, union music, community, engagement, social justice. So Matusow joins this group in New York. Pete Seeger had started it. And Matusow ends up getting alienated from the Communist Party because they're conducting this internal, it's kind of a purge. It's called a white chauvinism movement, where the Communist Party is concerned that their organization is full of white chauvinists, racist, essentially. It is very destructive. They ended up kicking out hundreds of people and marginalizing people, and this was all when the party itself was under attack by the U.S. government. So it's like, the worst possible conditions. But Matusow, who's a white guy, he's living up in Harlem. His girlfriend is an African-American woman working for the Amsterdam News, but it appears he becomes a target of this white chauvinism campaign because he has a job as a bill collector. And they say, well, that's racist. You're preying on Puerto Rican and black people. I mean, being a bill collector it's not a kind of job I would ever want. But Matusow had been a rising star, and suddenly he's under criticism, and he goes to the FBI and offers his services. So he becomes an informant for them for a year, and then he's kicked out of the group altogether, and then the FBI drops him as an agent. But the reason this all ties in is once he's out of the party and out of the FBI informing, he goes in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and he names Pete Seeger, Lee Hays, this singer from the group The Weaver. He names Woody Guthrie. He names Josh White, the blues singer. He names everybody. And suddenly subpoenas start happening for a lot of these folk singers. So the FBI didn't, they were following some of these people like Seeger and Guthrie, but some of these people hadn't been so pronounced on their radar. So it's not my view that the FBI even then or today is omnipotent, but they're also not stupid. And they do, follow the information that's in front of them, and sometimes it just lands in their lap.
And you're saying that this gentleman approached the FBI, they didn't approach him?
Yeah, it sounds like he was really alienated.
Okay.
And that, this is a problem. When you read about informers, it's people, because the disenchanted are oftentimes the most dangerous. There's this character, Morris Childs, right? He's not a folk singer, but he was a Daily Worker editor. He had a high position in the 40s. The Communist Party's newspaper was the Daily Worker. Morris Childs, he fell out on the wrong side of what they call a two-line struggle. The party had pushed out the former leader, Earl Browder, because Browder was getting a little too comfortable working with the capitalist class. The Communist Party in the 30s and 40s, they supported the Soviet Union, but a lot of their politics were social democratic. We want stronger unions, we want Social Security, we want unemployment, we want health care. I mean, it wasn't revolutionary communism. So Browder was aligned with this more social democratic strain, and, you know, turns in the world. Stalin kind of said, no, we're not doing that social democracy. We need countries and we need communist parties in power. And Browder came under attack. This guy Morris Childs had been aligned with Browder, so he went out of favor. And he had heart problems. He was sick. His wife left him because his politics were on the wrong side of this struggle. So this guy is just kind of laying up in bed, sick. You know, his friends won't talk to him anymore. He's totally alienated. The FBI got wind of it, and they went and visited him. Mm-hmm. And they paid for his health care at the Mayo Clinic, and they had long conversations. Childs is Jewish, so they have long conversations about the anti-Semitism prevalent, you know, in Stalin's Russia, and the purges, and they recruit him. And Morris Childs is in the Communist Party, and he's an FBI informant from like 1952 until almost 1980. He ends up being Gus Hall, who was the leader of the party's bag man, going back and forth to the Soviet Union, you know, picking up money to fund the Communist Party in the U.S. So it's not a good idea. You know, not that I'm offering anybody advice, but you know, don't alienate people like that. Right? No, it'll come back to haunt you.
Now, how would you describe your political leanings today?
I'm all over the place. I mean, I guess I'm on the left. Anti-capitalist, but I'm organizationally not affiliating, and I think I actually have as a center principle I'm not going to affiliate with any organization. I spent a lot of my adult life being a hardcore political activist, and have no interest in that whatsoever. I just feel like it just didn't work, and I'm not quite sure how one makes it work. But I think I'm generally, you know, on the left of things, but I'm mainly what I am is a writer and historian. So I'm very interested in the 20th century, or, you know, the 20th century U.S. history from like the 40s into the long 60s especially. And I'm very keen to look at this and get at what's there, and looking at it maybe in a way that I was never able to, or perhaps many people haven't yet been able to look at it and try to understand it. I've found an awful lot of information in the FBI files, but there's also an abundance of information in congressional hearings where, you know, people are under threat of perjury, so generally they're either going to tell the truth or they're going to shut up. So you can garner a lot from that, and there's an awful lot of memoirs. So there's a lot there to go back and look at it and start to get a different picture of things. You know, this folk singer book is a pretty keen example. I mean, and, you know, some of the myths, some things that you thought were solid, to paraphrase Marx, they melt into air when you actually look at some of the more specific details and such. But I'm hoping, you know, with my writing that I'm introducing people into some things that are interesting, things they may not have known about, but also I'm keen to promote and learn myself a methodology that kind of puts aside having a preconceived notion when going into something. It's, you know, there is a tendency I've seen, it's all over the place on the left and right, of, you know, the research is out to prove a point, and if it doesn't prove a point, then the research stops. And my thing is more like, well, you know, follow the research where it takes you, and then, you know, try to assess it. And if it takes you to a place that makes you cringe a little bit, well, you know, that's just reality, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. That's my same philosophy as well. A quick question, though, before we go to a break. Now, your field of study here is unique. FBI, surveillance, infiltration, provocateurs. When you look back at your own activism, do you see now, you look back and say, oh, man, this guy was right in front of me. He had to be an agent.
Well, yeah, I did. Unfortunately, I've not been able to garner evidence like, looking in the file and say, aha. Saying that, though, especially with the Revolutionary Union, Revolutionary Communist Party, we did discover some remarkable evidence of informants at the very top of this group when it was forming. I mean, it is my view that that group, and probably most groups, it's kind of a currency like, the FBI infiltrated and they destroyed this group and the FBI did this. And I don't really hold to that. I feel like it's a dynamic and it's a relationship. Like the Revolutionary Union had an informant, like in 1972, sitting on their secretariat. I mean, we don't have his informant filed. The FBI says they destroyed the file on this person. So we don't have 100% proof in the way of some files that have been released that this guy was an informant, but we have a overwhelming evidentiary trail that this guy was, giving information to the FBI. He was sitting on the secretariat of this group, which composed of 4 people who ran the day-to-day operations. And it was through our research, through a lot of pulling on strings, that we came to this conclusion. We actually discovered, I don't know if we have time for it right this second, but the FBI actually created this phony Maoist group in 1962-63, composed of about 6 informers who pretended they were a Maoist group operating in the pro-Soviet Communist Party as a way of disrupting it. And then they went on to use that to establish bona fides for informers. This guy who got to the head of the RU claimed he was part of this. It was called the Ad Hoc Committee for a Marxist-Leninist Party. It's a totally made-up thing by the FBI. I mean, we got the memos to prove it. The FBI is commending the agent who created it, Herb Stalling, saying, out of his own imagination, he created the Ad Hoc Committee for, it was like right out of Austin Powers when he's going through security and saying the penis enlarger isn't his, and then there's the book, this penis enlarger is mine. Anyway, Austin Powers, brilliant.
Yeah. I always suspected the New Alliance Party was sort of a constructed group.
Well, I can't speak to them, and they're sketchy in my memory.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm going to hold my tongue and maybe go Google that.
Yeah. Well, because Lenora Fulani wound up being vice presidential candidate with Pat Buchanan.
Oh, that's pretty awful.
How does that happen? Anyway,
Al Sharpton was an informant too for, I think, organized crime with the FBI or something. I mean, it actually happened.
Yeah, we just did a whole show about that yesterday with Casey Gain McGowan, who wrote the book, The Secret CIA War in Jamaica. And he's convinced now as well, although we don't have a smoking gun, that Sharpton was also CIA. And the guy from the Rampart, Winkler, I forget his name, Hinkle. Wow.
Okay.
He said it too. He said it years ago during the Tawana Brawley thing that Sharpton was CIA. But I'm going to throw you a curveball because I didn't mention this to you before, but your course of study here is FBI infiltration and surveillance. Have you run across any foreign intelligence meddling in leftist politics?
Well, I have, obviously, in reading and stuff. It's not my field of research, but, the big element in the first book, Heavy Radicals, about America's Maoists is, the relationship with, Maoist China. The person who was essential in the formation of this largest Maoist group in the United States was this person labeled Bergman, who had lived in China, him and his wife, Vicky Garvin, African-American woman. Both of those were veterans of the Communist Party USA, but when Khrushchev denounced Stalin, they became alienated. They ended up moving to China. China was looking for foreign teachers and foreign experts because they'd had this rift with the Soviet Union, and China was also very encouraging of beginning new communist parties that were more Maoistically inclined, if that's actually a word. So Bergman came back to the U.S., and the FBI considered him, in their language, a Chi-Com operative, a Chinese communist. So, I think that's, not true. I think Bergman was, interested in the United States. He considered himself, his fundamental interest was revolution in the United States. He wasn't just carrying out the behests of a foreign power. But as far as the FBI was concerned, their Bergman investigation, which encompassed probably close to 1 million pages, we actually don't have his full file. Wow. As far as they were concerned, there was an element of him being a foreign agent. It all gets very involved. I mean, counterintelligence is essentially to try to keep foreign agents from undermining your society, as well as, it's a proactive intelligence. It's, as opposed to just gathering information, counterintelligence is attempting to disrupt you. I mean, it's almost a warfare model of intelligence. It's not just this benign, we're going to tap your phone and transcribe the interview or something like that.
Gotcha. Now, if people go to your website, aaronleonard.net, you have some new exclusive groundbreaking information about the murder of Fred Hampton?
Yeah, it's Fred Hampton is, the character in Judas and the Black Messiah, which is up for Best Picture on Sunday, the Academy Awards, and the two lead actors, I believe they're both up for supporting actor roles. Excuse me if I'm misstating that. But so Fred Hampton was killed on December 4th, 1969. He was killed by the Chicago police in a raid. The Chicago police had the help of the FBI because an FBI informant gave them a floor plan of the house they were raiding. So the FBI and the CPD, both, essentially have that blood on their hands. I mean, Hampton was killed, as he lay in bed. He wasn't shooting at them. There was no matter of self-defense for the police. It was just brutal. It was probably payback for an incident a month earlier where a Panther had been killed and 2 Chicago cops had been killed. So I went to my mailbox here in California on December 4th, 2020. I'm looking at how much Roy Martin Mitchell weighed throughout the years for his yearly physical, what his blood pressure was, and, how he had evolved in the hierarchy, his different promotions. And then there's this memo from just a couple days after Fred Hampton's killed, and it's directed to Roy Martin Mitchell, basically commending him for his work on a special sensitive area for the FBI, and it's giving him a $200 bonus.
Wow.
And at the bottom it's typed in, related to the Black Panther Party. So it's clearly a commendation for his work in supplying information to the Chicago police via his informant for the murder of Fred Hampton. I actually reached out to the lawyers Jeffrey Haas and Flint Taylor. These two guys did remarkable work in the 70s, bringing a civil suit. I think it's a civil suit against Chicago and the FBI for the murder of Fred Hampton, and they were trying to prove FBI culpability. And when they saw this memo, they were like, "Oh Jesus! If we had had this, it would have, made a major impact on what." They ended up winning the case, but this this totally reinforced it. It's signed by J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh.
And it's, to Roy Martin Mitchell, and it's like job well done, essentially. I mean, it doesn't say job well done in the killing of Fred Hampton. It's a little bit more cleverly written than that. So, I got that, and Connor Gallagher's a writing colleague of mine, we dug back into the whole Hampton case, and we produced two major research pieces for Jacobin magazine. I believe it's jacobin.com. You can find it, but you go to my website, it's linked, and we look into the FBI campaign, the FBI effort against Fred Hampton. Some of the new stuff we discovered and some of the old stuff that maybe has kind of flown past people. And then we did a follow-up because I got the second batch of documents on Roy Martin Mitchell's personnel file a couple weeks after the first. And also, as a result of the JFK, Congress demanded any documents relating to the JFK assassination be released. So in the last 4 or 5 years, a whole bunch of stuff has been put online that is tangentially related to the JFK stuff. And in that is this hundreds of pages on the counterintelligence program against the Chicago Black Panther Party. So there's a lot more information about what the FBI was doing against the Chicago Panthers, both Hampton and the group as a whole. So, we've got these two major research pieces that I think add an awful lot more to the story. I mean, if people saw the film Judas and the Black Messiah, I think it's a fine film, but it is a film. It's not history. It's drama. It's art. And if you really want to understand the Fred Hampton stuff, I'm afraid you're going to have to do some work. If you just take the film itself as history, you're going to be a little confused, because of, the obligations of art are not the same as the obligations of history. But yeah, so we've got two major things that they get into that. It's all very interesting. I mean, I can talk more about that if you like, but.
Yeah, this is all on aaronleonard.net. If you go to the other writings page, the top 4 or 5 documents, they're all fresh off the presses, 331, 2021. It's like brand new stuff. I'm curious, what do you have here on Coretta Scott King, though?
Oh, her file was released some time ago. So the FBI had obviously, we know that the FBI wiretapped Martin Luther King. They were very concerned that his top aide, Stanley Levinson, was a concealed communist. The reason they thought this guy, Stanley Levinson, was a concealed communist is because this person I mentioned earlier, Morris Childs, him and his brother, Jack Childs, were FBI informants in the Communist Party when King was most active in the early 60s. And I believe it was Jack Childs was telling the FBI that Levinson was a concealed communist. I mean, it's a lot of detail and some of it's arcane, but that was the basis for signing a wiretap on Martin Luther King, is that this informant Jack Childs said, he's got this communist working with him. And most people kind of miss the fact that the person who signed the warrant, I mean, do you know this? Do you know who's, it's Bobby Kennedy who signed the warrant.
I did know that, yeah. The Kennedy warrant is nice, as people think. They were involved in a lot of that stuff, too, with McCarthy and stuff.
Yeah, Bobby Kennedy's first daughter, her godfather was Joe McCarthy, right? Bobby Kennedy's hardcore anti-communist before that. I think he might have had by the time he was running for president in '68, I suspect he had changed his outlook on some things. He'd had a wrenching, experience. Anyway, so Coretta Scott King is kind of coming under their purview because once her husband had been brutally murdered, assassinated, Stanley Levinson and her were still talking. So this suspected concealed communist was still in touch with Coretta King. So the FBI file on her remained open. But at this point, the FBI is more concerned that something bad happened to Mrs. King, because when Martin Luther King was killed, there were riots in every major city in the U.S., and they did not want to have anything to do with that happening with her. So they're actually concerned about her security, but they were also, monitoring her. I mean, it was, spying and intrusiveness. And then later on in the file, she's getting this awful mail from these just the most vile racists, and they're investigating that too. So it's a very interesting thing. It's almost paradoxical. They're, on the one hand, they're investigating her because they're very worried about communist ties. On the other hand, they're also having to deal with the fact that she's a hugely important public figure, and if something bad were to happen to her, that would be potentially catastrophic nationally and socially. So it's interesting stuff, but that's on truthout.org. There's an article on Coretta King. You just Google Coretta King and Aaron Leonard, it should come up. Also, I think there's a link on my website, too.
And to kind of take things full circle, and then later on it was Al Sharpton who brought Coretta Scott King to the box at the Republican convention where George Bush was being for his re-election there.
Al Sharpton is, one of these. I used to be kind of up on, I lived in New York, and during the huge days of rage in '88, '89, there were these awful racial killings of this young black man, Yusef Hawkins, by white racists. There was a Howard Beach killing, and Sharpton's in the center. And Sharpton is not a simple character. I mean, he's kind of always been there when these families are grieving, and he's, genuinely empathetic and kind of helps spotlight the thing. But then there are things about his past that are, very curious.
Did you look into his files?
No, I haven't. I just remember reading Newsday at the time when they were talking. I was reading that, and I was also reading how Rudy Giuliani and Al D'Amato were trying to buy crack in Washington Heights. It's because you got to have fun when you read the newspapers. You know what I mean?
Aaron J. Leonard, we're out of time. In 2 minutes, what do you want to leave us with?
Oh, just go to the website. If you're curious about the evolution of music, up to today, the Folk Singers in the Bureau is a good place to get grounded. I hope I'm telling an entertaining story. I try to write a book that I'd want to read, and I'm not all that patient with dry historical writing. So read it and tell me if I'm wrong. But pick that up. That's what I would leave you with.
Yeah, send him some feedback to his website there, AaronLeonard.net. And you're on Twitter too, right?
It's LeonAAO1.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aaron J. Leonard. Good night.
Okay, thanks for having me on.
Thank you.